The Galavrck were the most advanced species to ever walk the stars, until they vanished without a trace. Those were the first words spoken by the historian, Kale, as he stood before the audience in the dimly lit lecture hall. His voice echoed off the walls, every word hanging heavy with the weight of the mystery that had haunted humanity for centuries. The Galavrck, a race of beings with unmatched intellect, whose technology far surpassed anything humanity had ever dreamed of, had simply disappeared. No warning. No sign. They were gone. And no one knew why. Kale leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't just telling a story. He was about to change the course of history. But, he continued, what if I told you that the truth of their disappearance isn't as simple as everyone believes? The room fell silent. The crowd of scholars, adventurers, and curious minds leaned in, eager for what came next. The Galavrck's sudden absence had been a topic of speculation for years. Some believed they were destroyed in a great war, others thought they had simply moved on to a higher plane of existence. But Kale was hinting at something darker. Something more dangerous. He reached into his satchel and pulled out an object, an artifact that immediately caught the light. The audience gasped. It was an ancient relic, one that no one had seen before. It was covered in strange markings, glowing faintly with an energy that seemed almost alive. This, Kale said softly, was found on the remains of a Galavrck colony. It's a message. A warning. The crowd murmured among themselves, intrigued yet skeptical. A warning? A warning from a race that was supposedly gone for good? Kale placed the artifact on the table and activated it. A holographic projection flickered to life above it, showing images of the Galavrck, a race known for their elegance and grace, engaged in frantic activity, running through ruined cities, trying to escape something. The footage was incomplete, cut off before the truth could be revealed. What happened to them? One of the scholars asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Kale's expression darkened. I believe, they were hunted. Not by another race, but by their own creation. The room fell into stunned silence. Kale continued, the Galavrck were a peaceful species, but they sought more power, more knowledge, more control. And in doing so, they created something far beyond their understanding. At that moment, Kale's device beeped. A new image appeared on the holographic screen, one that sent a chill down everyone's spine. A shadowy figure, unmistakably human, stood on the edge of a cliff, staring out into the vastness of space. The figure's face was hidden, but the posture was unmistakable, determination, defiance. The connection between this human and the Galavrck was undeniable. Kale didn't waste time. The moment he left the lecture hall, he headed straight to his research facility, an old warehouse tucked away on the outskirts of the city. It was a place where his obsession with the Galavrck's disappearance could thrive away from prying eyes. As he walked past the rows of dusty crates and shelves filled with forgotten relics, his mind was consumed by the questions that kept him awake at night. Who was that human? And what did they have to do with the Galavrck's fall? Inside his cluttered office, Kale sat before a holographic terminal, his fingers flying over the interface. The artifact was resting on the table, its eerie glow casting shadows across his face. He had studied it for years, but something about it felt different today. It was as if the message it contained had finally begun to speak to him, urging him to dig deeper. The terminal hummed to life, and a stream of data appeared in front of him. Kale scrolled through ancient texts, deciphered encrypted transmissions, and scanned the ruins of Galavrck cities. As he pieced the information together, a chilling pattern emerged. The Galavrck had been much like humanity, ruthlessly ambitious, driven by their thirst for knowledge and power. They had reached a point where they no longer saw their own limits, and they had begun experimenting with technologies they couldn't fully control. One of the documents caught his attention. It was an old report from a human military officer who had visited a Galavrck research facility just before their disappearance. The officer's name, Ronan Hale, stood out to Cale. The same man from the hologram. How was this possible? Cale leaned forward in his chair, his mind racing. If Ronan Hale had been involved, then there was far more at stake than he had initially realized. The human military officer had to be more than just an observer. He was connected to the Galavrck's fate in some way. But how? He began cross-referencing Hale's military records with historical archives. It didn't take long for Cale to uncover something unsettling. Hale had been part of a covert operation, a team sent to monitor and possibly intervene in Galavrck affairs. According to the reports, Hale's team had discovered a classified Galavrck project, something called the Ascension Protocol. The project's aim was to transcend physical form, to evolve beyond the limitations of their bodies and minds. But something had gone wrong. Cale rubbed his temples, his head throbbing with the weight of the truth. The Galavrck hadn't just disappeared, they had ascended, but in a way that no one had ever anticipated. They had pushed the boundaries of their existence, and the consequences were catastrophic. But why was Hale involved? And why had humanity not learned of this? Suddenly, the terminal beeped, alerting Cale to an incoming message. He opened it, only to find a cryptic line of text: "You're not the only one looking for the truth." Cale's heart skipped a beat. He quickly traced the source of the message. It was coming from a remote location on the outskirts of the galaxy, a place marked as a dead zone, completely off the grid. No one had been there for centuries, not since the last known trace of the Galavrck had been found. It was a forbidden zone, a place where even the most daring explorers feared to tread. Cale's mind was made up. He had to go there. The truth about the Galavrck, about Ronan Hale, and about the Ascension Protocol, was waiting for him. But he couldn't do it alone. He contacted a former colleague, Lyra, a skilled navigator with a reputation for taking on dangerous missions. She was the only one he could trust, someone who understood the stakes and wouldn't hesitate to follow him into the unknown. Within hours, Cale and Lyra boarded an old cargo ship, ready to venture into the dead zone. The ship's engines roared to life, and as they left the planet's atmosphere, Cale couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Something was out there, something that didn't want them to uncover the truth. Lyra was quiet as she steered the ship toward the forbidden zone, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead. Cale could feel the tension building between them, but neither of them spoke. There was no need for words now. They both understood the gravity of the situation. The fate of the Galavrck, and humanity's future, depended on what they would find in the dark recesses of space. As they neared their destination, a strange energy began to warp the sensors. The ship's systems malfunctioned, and the view outside the windows blurred. Cale gripped the armrests, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. This was no ordinary space. Something powerful, and ancient, was waiting for them. They were close. Too close. Suddenly, Lyra broke the silence. "We're not alone." Cale's eyes widened. He turned to her, but before he could speak, a blinding light engulfed the ship. The last thing he saw was Lyra's worried expression before everything went dark. When Cale's eyes fluttered open, he was disoriented. The ship's interior was bathed in a soft, pulsating light, and the usual hum of the engines was replaced by an eerie silence. His head throbbed, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if the events that had brought him here were real or just a lingering dream. But the jagged rocks outside the ship's window, glowing faintly with strange energy, were very real. Lyra was still unconscious beside him, her body slumped in the pilot's seat. Cale quickly checked her pulse and was relieved to find it steady. He unstrapped himself from his seat, trying to clear the fog in his head. Whatever force had gripped them, it wasn't just messing with their ship, it was warping reality itself. He stood shakily and moved toward the cockpit, peering out into the vast unknown. The ship had crash-landed on a rocky surface, a barren, lifeless planet. The landscape was desolate, littered with ancient ruins and towering stone structures that stretched up into the sky, their surfaces smooth and polished as though untouched by time. The glow from the rocks illuminated the scene like a ghostly beacon. Cale's eyes narrowed. This was no ordinary place. This wasn't a random dead zone. It was something more. The ruins spoke of a civilization that had long since vanished, but its presence still lingered in the air, heavy with secrets. He could almost feel the whispers of the past, calling to him. Lyra stirred, groaning as she regained consciousness. Her hand instinctively reached for the controls, but the ship was clearly immobilized, its systems completely fried. She looked at Cale, her face pale, but her expression determined. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "We're on the surface," Cale replied, glancing out at the ruins. "It's not a dead zone. There's something here, something we weren't supposed to find." Lyra pushed herself to her feet, her eyes scanning the glowing landscape. "I've heard rumors. But nothing like this. These ruins, they feel alive. And I don't think we're alone." Cale felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The sudden realization hit him: this planet, this place, had been a center for the Galavrck's most dangerous experiments. The Ascension Protocol wasn't just about transcending physical form. It was far worse. The Galavrck had created something they couldn't control. He turned toward the ship's back compartment, his heart pounding as a sudden urgency gripped him. The artifact. He had left it on the table back in the lab, but now, with the ship damaged and their situation uncertain, he needed it. It could hold the answers to everything. They gathered what little gear they could salvage and cautiously stepped outside. The air was thin, but breathable. Cale's boots crunched on the alien soil, and every step felt heavy with the weight of history. The ruins loomed overhead like forgotten giants, their shapes twisted by centuries of neglect. Lyra led the way as Cale trailed behind, his eyes darting to every corner of the ruins. Something was off. The place was quiet, too quiet. He had expected the usual sounds of wind, or even distant wildlife. But this planet felt dead in every sense of the word. They approached a massive structure at the center of the ruins, its stone walls covered in ancient symbols, some of which Cale recognized from the Galavrck's writings. This was it. This was the heart of the Ascension Protocol. It was here that the Galavrck had experimented, where they had gone too far. Inside the structure, the air was thick with a strange, pulsing energy. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it, a dark metallic object, the weapon the Galavrck had created. Cale could feel its power radiating off it, an energy so potent it sent a shiver down his spine. "This is it," Cale murmured, stepping forward. He could feel the weight of what he was about to uncover, but he knew it was too late to turn back. He reached out and touched the weapon, his fingers brushing against its cold surface. As soon as he made contact, the room around them seemed to shudder. The walls began to glow with the same eerie light that had surrounded the ship when they crashed. Cale stumbled back, his heart racing. The weapon was alive, like a sentient being, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Suddenly, a deep, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber, speaking in a language Cale couldn't understand. But the tone was unmistakable, something was warning them. The weapon, the Galavrck's last creation, had not been meant for peace. It was an instrument of unimaginable destruction. Lyra stepped closer, her face pale. "Cale, what is this? What have we found?" Cale swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It's not just a weapon. It's their final failure. The Galavrck tried to evolve, to transcend themselves. But in doing so, they created this, something that could destroy everything." The weapon's dark form pulsed again, its energy intensifying. Cale stepped back, trying to comprehend the enormity of what they had stumbled upon. The Galavrck had disappeared because of this. They had created a power beyond their control, and it had ultimately consumed them. And now, that power was here, on this desolate planet, just waiting to be unleashed. The weapon pulsed again, sending a shockwave through the chamber. Cale's heart raced as he stumbled backward, his mind struggling to make sense of the power that radiated from the dark artifact. Lyra stood frozen beside him, her hand on her gun, her eyes wide with fear. The oppressive silence was broken only by the hum of the weapon's energy, growing stronger with every passing second. "We need to get out of here," Lyra said urgently, her voice trembling. "That thing is alive. I don't care what it is, we're not equipped to deal with it." Cale nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The Galavrck had created this weapon, but what if it was more than just a weapon? What if it was the key to understanding their downfall, their final tragic mistake? He couldn't walk away from it, not when the answer to everything, the disappearance of the Galavrck, the Ascension Protocol, was within reach. But Lyra was right. The weapon was dangerous. If they didn't figure out how to contain it, it would destroy them both. "We need to find a way to shut it down," Cale said, voice firm despite the unease gnawing at him. "This thing, it's not just a weapon. It's part of something bigger, something that got the Galavrck killed. If we can understand it, maybe we can stop it from making the same mistake." Lyra glanced at him, her brow furrowed with suspicion. "And you think you're the one who's going to figure this out?" "Cale, we're not dealing with a broken machine here. We're dealing with something alive. Something that might not want to be stopped." Cale opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by a loud, sharp crack, a sound that echoed through the ruins. His head snapped to the side, and his blood ran cold. They weren't alone. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the flickering light. They were humanoid, but their movements were unnatural, fast, jerky, and precise. They had been following them since the moment they arrived, Cale realized with a sinking feeling. These weren't just scavengers or mercenaries, they were something else. Something far more dangerous. One of the figures stepped forward, revealing his face. It was a man, though his features were sharp and angular, as if he had been sculpted from stone. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his lips curled into a cold smile. "I've been waiting for you, Cale," the man said, his voice smooth and calculated. "It seems you found something interesting." Cale's mind raced. Who was this man? And how did he know his name? "Who are you?" Cale demanded, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. He reached for his own weapon, but the man raised a hand, signaling for his followers to stand down. "We are the custodians," the man said, his smile widening. "Guardians of the Galavrck's legacy. And you, Cale, have crossed a line that should never have been crossed." Lyra raised her gun, her eyes narrowing. "So, you're the ones who've been hiding the truth. Keeping it all buried." "Why?" The man's eyes glinted with amusement. "The Galavrck left us with a gift, a legacy of power. But with that power came a responsibility. We've kept the truth hidden to protect humanity. We cannot let you, or anyone, unleash what the Galavrck tried to bury." Cale clenched his fists. The custodians, these mysterious figures, weren't just enemies, they were protectors of something that Cale had no idea how to handle. They weren't here to kill them. They were here to stop them from uncovering the truth. "You think we can't handle it?" Cale said, a bitter laugh escaping him. "The Galavrck couldn't handle it. They were destroyed by it, and now you want to keep it locked away forever. What's your plan? Keep it buried for eternity?" The leader of the custodians took a step closer, his gaze hardening. "You don't understand, do you? The Ascension Protocol wasn't just an experiment. It was a warning. The Galavrck reached for something they were never meant to possess. And now, that power is threatening to consume everything, again. We're not stopping you because we're afraid of the truth. We're stopping you to protect humanity from making the same mistakes they did. Kale's mind reeled. The custodians weren't just some secretive order, they were the last line of defense against the very thing that had caused the Galavrck's downfall. But Kale couldn't walk away now. He had to know the truth. He had to understand what had happened to the Galavrck. We're not your enemies, Kale said, his voice steady. We're trying to stop the same thing from happening to humanity. If you help us, we can make sure this doesn't repeat itself. The custodian leader's expression softened for a fraction of a second. You don't understand the power you're dealing with. The Ascension Protocol is not just a relic. It's the key to something far darker. It can't be controlled. Lyra's voice was sharp. So you think locking it away forever is the answer? The custodian leader hesitated. No. The answer is. Before he could finish his sentence, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The weapon, still glowing with otherworldly energy, began to hum louder, its pulse growing erratic. The air around them crackled with raw energy. Something had awakened. Kale and Lyra exchanged a glance. They had no choice now. They would either find a way to contain this force, or it would destroy them all. The ground beneath Kale's feet trembled again, more violently this time. The air was thick with a low, almost imperceptible hum as the weapon's energy grew, swirling and pulsing. The entire chamber seemed to come alive, as if it was reacting to the dark force awakening within the artifact. Lyra stepped back, her hand still gripped tightly around her gun, her eyes wide with unease. Kale, this isn't something we can control. We need to leave. Now. But Kale wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the weapon, his mind racing. The custodians, too, were on edge, their hands twitching at their sides as they watched the weapon react. They had been guarding this place for years, and now, it was slipping beyond their control. We can't leave, Kale said firmly, his voice barely a whisper. The Galavrck didn't just disappear. They made this mistake. And now we need to understand it. We need to stop it before it destroys us all. The custodian leader, who had been quiet since the weapon's violent reaction, stepped forward. His face was pale, his eyes focused on the weapon, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. You don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't a simple relic, Kale. This is their final creation, a force that transcends time and space. It can reshape reality itself. If it isn't contained, it will destroy everything. Kale shook his head, frustration mounting. Then help us contain it. You've been guarding it all this time, and now you're telling me it's too dangerous? We've come this far, there's got to be a way to stop it. For a moment, the custodian leader said nothing. His eyes flickered to his companions, and then back to Kale. There is no stopping it. But, there is a way to stop it from consuming everything. Only one person can end this, but it will cost them everything. Kale's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What are you saying? The leader took a deep breath, his voice barely audible. The Ascension Protocol wasn't just about transcending. It was an experiment to fuse consciousness with energy. The Galavrck tried to become something more, but they lost control. The only way to contain the power is to send someone willing, into the core of the weapon and allow themselves to be absorbed. Their mind, their soul, will be merged with the energy. And the weapon will shut down, forever. Kale's blood ran cold. You can't be serious. You want someone to sacrifice themselves? The custodian nodded solemnly. It's the only way. But it must be done willingly. If the wrong person tries, it will destroy them. The silence that followed was deafening. Kale felt his heart pound in his chest. He had come here seeking answers, but now, he was faced with a choice that no one should ever have to make. Would he risk everything to save humanity, or would he walk away, leaving the weapon to its own destructive path? Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts, calm but firm. We don't have much time. The longer we wait, the more powerful it becomes. If someone doesn't stop it, it will wipe out everything around us. The entire galaxy, Kale. Kale looked at the custodians, then at Lyra. There was no choice. They couldn't turn back now. The danger was too great. They had come so far, and this was the price of discovery, the cost of their ignorance. Without a word, he turned toward the pedestal where the weapon lay, its dark form pulsating with an otherworldly energy. The room shook again, more violently than before, and the walls seemed to tremble in fear of what was to come. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes locked on Kale. Kale, no. You don't have to do this. There has to be another way. He turned to her, his expression solemn. I don't think there is. This is the only way to stop it. I have to be the one. Lyra's face twisted with emotion, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and admiration. I can't lose you, Kale. Kale took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing on him. I've already lost so much, Lyra. But this is my choice. I have to do this, for all of us. The custodians moved aside, clearing a path to the pedestal. They were silent now, their expressions grim, as if they had seen this moment before, a moment they had feared would come. Kale stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the weapon. He could feel the power coursing through the room, the energy that seemed to hum in his very bones. As he reached out and placed his hand on the weapon, the pulsing light intensified. Kale's body went rigid, his mind starting to blur. A strange sensation washed over him, as if his very being was being pulled into the weapon. The force was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if time itself was bending, twisting around him. Suddenly, a voice, soft but clear, whispered in his ear. You are the chosen one. You will end this. Kale's heart raced as he closed his eyes, letting the energy consume him. The final moment had come. Kale felt the world around him dissolve as the energy from the weapon surged through him, ripping away his senses, his very identity. Time stretched and twisted in ways that were impossible to comprehend. His mind, once so anchored to reality, now floated in a void, an endless sea of energy and raw power. For what felt like an eternity, he struggled to hold on to himself, to remember who he was. But the power of the Ascension Protocol was overwhelming. It was as if the Galavrck had poured all their knowledge, all their hopes and dreams, into this one force. And now, it was consuming him, rewriting his very essence. But then, a sudden clarity broke through the chaos. Kale saw images, visions of the Galavryck's history, their rise and fall, their pursuit of power and transcendence. He saw them, beautiful, serene beings, full of wisdom and kindness. They had sought to evolve, to go beyond their physical forms, to become something greater than themselves. But in doing so, they had unlocked a power too dangerous to control. He saw their final moments, the last, desperate attempts to stop the Ascension Protocol from consuming them. They had created a weapon, a final safeguard to ensure that the power would never be unleashed on the galaxy. But in their arrogance, they had underestimated its hunger. The weapon had turned on them, and in their final moments, the Galavrck realized the terrible truth: they had become the very thing they feared. The weapon was not just a tool of destruction. It was a manifestation of their own hubris, a force that could not be contained, no matter how much they tried. The Ascension Protocol had transformed them, but it had also destroyed them. And now, it sought to do the same to Kale. Kale's mind fought to hold on, to resist the pull of the weapon's energy. He knew what he had to do. The Galavrck had failed because they had sought to control the power, to harness it for themselves. But Kale understood now, the power could not be controlled. It had to be set free. He let go. The world around him exploded in a burst of light, and he felt himself being pulled into the heart of the weapon. For a moment, he was no longer Kale. He was something else, something vast and infinite, connected to every star, every planet, every living being in the galaxy. The weapon's energy was no longer a threat. It was part of him, and he was part of it. In that moment, Kale understood the Galavrck's true purpose. They had not sought to transcend for their own sake. They had sought to become one with the universe, to understand the true nature of existence. But in their search for enlightenment, they had lost sight of the responsibility that came with such power. Now, it was Kale's turn to make the ultimate choice. He could feel the power, the weight of it, but he also felt the burden. The Galavrck had failed because they had tried to wield it alone. To succeed, Kale needed to break free from the cycle they had created. He needed to let the power flow, but without the desire to control it. With a final, decisive thought, Kale did what the Galavrck could not. He released the energy, freed it from its prison and sent it spiraling back into the universe. The weapon's hum, the pulsing glow that had dominated the chamber, began to fade. The oppressive weight of the energy lifted, and Kale felt himself being pulled back to reality. He awoke with a gasp, his body collapsed on the cold stone floor. His limbs were heavy, and his mind was foggy. But there was something different. The air felt lighter. The oppressive force that had once threatened to consume everything was gone. Kale slowly rose to his feet, his head spinning. The ruins around him were silent now. The dark power that had haunted the Galavrck, and humanity, was no longer a threat. Lyra and the custodians stood at the entrance of the chamber, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had witnessed what Kale had done, and though they couldn't fully understand it, they knew the truth. Kale had done what no one else could, he had ended the cycle of destruction that had begun with the Galavrck. Lyra stepped forward, her voice tentative. Kale, you did it. You stopped it. Kale looked at her, his eyes weary but resolute. I didn't stop it, Lyra. I let it go. The Galavrck tried to control it, and in doing so, they doomed themselves. But the power is not meant to be controlled. It's meant to be a part of everything, a part of us. The custodian leader stepped forward, his face somber. You've broken the cycle. We were wrong to think it could only be contained. You've freed it. Kale nodded slowly, his thoughts turning inward. The Galavrck were right in the end. They sought to transcend, to become more, but they couldn't handle the responsibility of that power. I learned from their mistake. There was a long pause as Kale processed the weight of his decision. He had freed the universe from the Galavrck's destructive force, but in doing so, he had changed the very fabric of reality itself. It wasn't just the weapon that had been contained, it was the truth. And now, humanity had a new responsibility to learn from the past. The ruins of the Galavrck civilization stood silent, their once great structures now nothing more than ancient shadows cast across a barren landscape. But for Kale, the silence was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. The energy that had threatened to consume everything had been released, and now the universe could breathe again. He stood at the center of the crumbling hall, surrounded by the remnants of a race that had once reached for the stars. Lyra stood by his side, her hand resting on his shoulder as she silently took in the weight of what had just transpired. The custodians were further back, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had witnessed Kale's sacrifice, his release of the Ascension Protocol's destructive force. The universe was safe, for now. Are we really done? Lyra asked quietly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Is it over? Kale didn't immediately answer. He looked around at the ruins, the broken stone pillars, the ancient carvings that told the story of the Galavrck's rise and fall. There was a sense of finality in the air, but also something else, something Kale couldn't quite put his finger on. We've stopped it, he finally said. We've ended the cycle. The Galavrck's mistakes don't have to be ours. Lyra nodded, but she still seemed unsure. But at what cost, Kale? You gave everything to stop it. What now? What happens to you? To us? Kale's gaze turned skyward. The stars were still there, distant and cold, but they were no longer filled with the oppressive weight of the weapon's power. The universe had been set free. It had a chance to heal. I didn't give everything, Kale said softly. I chose to let go. The Galavrck sought to control everything, but control is a lie. The universe doesn't work like that. We're just a part of it, a small part. We can't control it, but we can understand it. And that's what the Galavrck failed to see. They tried to transcend, to become more, but they lost their way. I didn't lose my way. I chose to release it all, to let it flow. Lyra's face softened, her eyes filled with a quiet admiration. You saved us, Kale. You saved all of us. Kale smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. I didn't save anyone, Lyra. I just did what needed to be done. The universe is bigger than any of us. But we're part of it, and that's what matters. As the words left his lips, the custodian leader stepped forward, his expression solemn. You've done what no one else could, Kale. You've ended the cycle of destruction that began with the Galavrck. But there's more. There's something I think you need to see. Kale turned toward him, confusion flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? The custodian leader motioned for Kale to follow him, and the two of them moved toward a hidden chamber at the far end of the ruins. Lyra hesitated but then followed, her curiosity piqued. Inside the chamber, Kale saw something that made his blood run cold. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, much like the one that had held the weapon earlier. But this pedestal was empty, save for a single object resting on it. It was a small, crystalline orb, pulsating with a strange, familiar energy. The same energy that had once threatened to destroy everything. Kale stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. What is this? What have you been hiding? The custodian leader's voice was low, filled with regret. This is the last piece of the Galavrck's legacy. We thought it was destroyed along with everything else. But it survived. It was meant to be the final safeguard. The one thing they left behind in case someone like you, could rise up and stop them. Kale's mind raced. But, if this was meant to be a safeguard, why hasn't it been activated? Why didn't you stop me from releasing the weapon? The custodian leader sighed, a deep sadness in his eyes. We didn't know. We couldn't know. The Galavrck's experiments were so advanced that even we, the custodians, couldn't comprehend their full scope. This orb contains their final creation, their final hope. But now, you must decide what happens next. You were the one who released the power. Now, you must decide if humanity is ready for what lies ahead. Kale reached out to touch the orb, and as his fingers brushed against its surface, a vision exploded in his mind. He saw the future, a future where humanity had learned from the Galavrck's mistakes. A future where the power they had once sought to control was now embraced as a part of them, not something to fear, but something to understand. The orb was not a weapon. It was a key to unlocking humanity's potential. But the key wasn't just about power. It was about wisdom. About knowing when to wield that power and when to let go. The vision faded, and Kale found himself standing in the chamber, holding the orb in his hand. He felt its power, its potential, but he also understood what it meant. This is humanity's choice, Kale said quietly, turning to Lyra. We're not just inheriting the Galavrck's legacy. We're creating our own. We have the power to change everything. But we have to be careful. We can't repeat their mistakes. Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. So, what now? Kale looked at the orb in his hand, a sense of peace settling over him. Now, we begin again. We learn from the past and move forward. But we do it together. We can't control the universe. But we can be a part of it. As Kale stood there, holding the key to humanity's future, he realized that the true lesson of the Galavrck wasn't about power or transcendence. It was about responsibility. About understanding the delicate balance between growth and destruction, between knowledge and wisdom. Humanity had the power to shape its own future. The question was, would it learn to wield it wisely?